Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the cage, a masterclass live. Irina Tsukerman is a US-based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you. Glad to be here as always.
You're welcome. Welcome. So, several big topics again. Again, Irina, big one. Let's talk about some peace. Russia-Ukraine indirect peace talks in Saudi Arabia. Shuttle diplomacy, technical issues, maritime ceasefire. Several things there. Help us understand what is this whole indirect meeting all about.
Well, it's interesting because Ukraine and Russia had very different perspectives on the point of this gathering. Ukraine went in there hoping to simply establish a framework for future negotiations to discuss technical issues. Russia was there to negotiate a partial maritime ceasefire agreement that would also include energy infrastructure ceasefire. Russia was in a better position going in with the negotiations. It was looking at essentially securing its interests in the Black Sea, restoring its full presence there after suffering heavy blows by Ukrainian forces. Ukraine was looking for a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire that would be enforceable and to get security guarantees against further violations by Russia. And as for Saudi Arabia, it was looking to grow its mediating role and to look at potential opportunities in the Black Sea region, including security, trade, potential strengthening of relations with other states in the region. And it certainly achieved that goal. It was featured in a high-profile way and had a complicated job of ensuring that each side was going to feel it was treated fairly, enforcing time limits, enforcing an atmosphere that was conducive to the talks. The talks lasted well over 8 to 10 hours, so it was very intense negotiations. At the end of the day, an agreement was reached, but it was breached by Russia almost immediately, and numerous attacks on energy infrastructure in Ukraine followed, as well as attacks on civilian targets in various cities, including Kharkiv and Dnipro. So that ceasefire agreement did not last very long, to put it mildly.
Absolutely.
And it's worth noting also that the Russian team was headed by a senior intelligence official. Ukraine stuck to lower profile figures, and of course US was there to mediate as well, and it talked to each side separately, essentially sending emissaries from one room to the next to conduct these shuttle diplomacy talks.
Absolutely, Irina. So, what is US role here? What is Saudi Arabia's role here? What does US get out of this beyond minerals, and what does Saudi Arabia get out of this?
Well, for US, securing a ceasefire would have been a big diplomatic victory, because then Trump could claim credit and say that they're on the way to settling the conflict, or at least putting the two countries on a path towards peace building. However, because it backfired so spectacularly, I would say it was almost worse than if nothing was done at all. Because Russia demanded initially acquiesced to the ceasefire, but then it demanded sanctions relief. US promised to assist Russia with returning to the world market, which included potential re-swifting, joining the US-based banking SWIFT system. But there, U.S. realized that it overpromised and was unable to deliver. The European Union, which is part of this swift sanctions enforcement system, basically said that Russia would not be admitted back until they withdrew their forces from all of Ukraine, which Russia naturally isn't going to do. So they came to an impasse, and U.S. was simply not able to deliver on Russia's new demands that were put forth after the conclusion of the agreement. So U.S. was left with egg on its face, and Russia went right back to bombing Ukraine. By the way, mostly civilian, not military positions.
Right, right, Irina. So who is dictating these talks? Does it look like US is dictating these talks? Does it look like Putin is dictating these talks, not coming out in the open?
It
Or
will.
Ukraine, does it look like Ukraine has any say in all these things?
Well, Ukraine was essentially faced with no choice but to participate in this particular format and to try to ensure that its rights were protected in some way. And for Ukraine, it wasn't uh, agreeing to a partial ceasefire. I think Ukraine expected it to be violated quickly, and I think they agreed to show good faith effort on their part, that they were not the hindrance, that they were not the obstruction in these talks, because US went all in on it. The big winner was actually Saudi Arabia, because it did not have to do much other than be present, enforce the rules, and unlike the US, it did not put any direct stakes and make any promises. It was not party to the negotiations, it was a neutral mediator, and as such, it did raise its profile without having to sacrifice its credibility in the talks. And in this way, US was overshadowed by Saudi Arabia, which came out getting exactly what it wanted out of these negotiations, strengthening its relations with both Russia and Ukraine. As for the US, it was left looking very weak after this talk, and also raising questions about its own neutrality as a mediator in the talks, because it seems to be single-handedly giving and giving and giving to Russia without enforcing ceasefire violations or backtracking, bad faith backtracking by Russia.
Right, right, Irina. So let's look at this whole scenario. So in a talk which is about Europe, Europe is almost out. Only European, warring factions are part of these talks, but Euro seems to be almost out. What does it say about not only the present, but also the future?
The European Union has not taken kindly to being left out. They are currently discussing their own security frameworks, which are not easy to come up with for many reasons: building capacity, figuring out what role US is and isn't going to play within NATO when US has clearly not made up its own mind. Figuring out the leadership role, figuring out whether Europe will be investing into a centralized, unified military force, or simply trying to come up with individual forces, dealing with other issues besides Ukraine, such as Russian sabotage inside Europe. All of these things are taking a toll. And it's not an easy scenario, but the Black Sea region is not just Ukraine. It affects multiple European Union countries and multiple NATO members. So the fact that Russia is making deals that would affect the entire region without Europe being present there seems to the European leadership to be a scenario that is grossly unfair. Now, Russia accused Europe of not taking the initiative themselves, not engaging with Putin, but of course, engaging with Putin would have been a fool's errand. It would have ended before it got started, the same way it ended with the United States. So the only way to really appears to be move forward with any sort of negotiation with Russia is to endlessly give concessions or not negotiate at all, which is what Europe has chosen to do. Now Europe does have some leverage. out of keeping Russia out of the SWIFT system and trying to use it as economic leverage to get Russia out of Ukraine. The problem is, without a unified position with the United States, that's going to be much harder to achieve. If US gives Russia any economic or political breaks, Russia will certainly use that opportunity to as a lifeline to strengthen its positions and thus have even less incentive to leave Ukraine. So we are neither here nor there in the situation. It's simply prolonging the misery without being able to come up with any conclusive solution.
Absolutely, Irene. As you put it, we are neither here nor there in this situation. So, to understand this better, for someone who is not part of Europe, any of these places, someone in India, someone in anywhere else, trying to understand this, how should we understand? Are we moving towards peace, or is it just peace talks are just an optics and nothing more? And peace has to wait. How does it look?
I don't think US understands that peace coming at the cost of security is no peace at all, and that Russia has no incentive to settle so far as the US is willing to go along with its demands and not penalize it for violations and for wasting time, because the time spent with the negotiating team could have been spent on resolving other crises. In the meantime, Russia is with complete impunity attacking civilian infrastructure and making US look very weak. I don't see what peace is possible unless Russia is willing to admit defeat, at least on some fronts, and to move forward to good faith concessions. But so far, all the pressure has been on Ukraine. US has been putting forth the thesis that Ukraine would inevitably lose. That is not really such a clear-cut scenario. Ukraine is raising innovation and superiority in some areas, and if US had continued to supply it with better weapons, I think it could easily overcome Russia, which is mostly using human waves and some weapons from Iran to achieve any kind of structure. And now Ukraine is also getting F-16s from Denmark, so that could also make a difference in the near future. Ukraine has been pushed out of Kursk, but it reinvaded Russia through Belgorod, which essentially gives them a new front and reestablishes the leverage lost thanks to U.S. intervention. And so far, U.S. has failed at preventing Ukraine from defending itself as well. So this is increasingly making U.S. look getting the worst of both worlds, not getting a major diplomatic breakthrough, and also looking like it's siding with the aggressor for no good reason.
Absolutely, Irina. And let's look at the Russia-US dynamics also here. Means in the recent talk between Putin and Trump, means Trump is being asked to wait for 1.5 hours. Is that, if I'm understanding that correctly? What is
Yes.
Steve Witkoff's role here? And Putin rejects ceasefire, and the US is continuing with concessions to Russia. Means I don't know who is the leader here. Who is telling whom to do what?
Well, this is as some analysts have put it, Trump is all about business, and so he is apparently prioritizing potential for business arrangements with Russia over geopolitical diplomatic wins. So he's willing to sacrifice his dignity, time, Ukraine, even U.S. security, which includes the return of hundreds of Russian spies to U.S. Soil in exchange for very speculative potential arrangements with the Russian governments or oligarchs and whatever. So far, Russia has not even lowered aluminum prices, as it floated as a possibility in exchange for U.S. assistance So US is really not getting anything out of it at this point in time. If there are any private deals between Witkoff and Putin that would benefit specific officials or members of the administration or their business interests, we know nothing about it. But in terms of US national interest, there's no evidence that there's anything beneficial going on, other than Putin and his propagandists on TV literally laughing at the US president and the fact that he had to wait for an hour and a half for a call. Witkov came out looking no better from the meeting. He praised Putin and he bought into a story that Putin supposedly prayed for Trump in some church in Russia, which seems like a completely incredible scenario. Putin is a former KGB officer. He was an atheist most of his life. Even if he attends church for the optics today, it's very unlikely that he'd be praying for Trump, who himself is not particularly religious. So all of this seems to be like a very badly written script for the public, and somehow Witkov, who has zero experience in geopolitics but does have extensive business contacts in Russia, has fallen, genuinely seems to have fallen for this narrative, and was talking about it on Tucker Carlson show. And let's face it, Tucker himself was used as a useful dupe by Putin, who came out to be rather critical of their interview at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Trump is making a lot of news. His special envoys are also making a lot of news. His representatives are making a lot of news. And amid this, here comes, you talk about the tariff thing. Again, he insists about Canada to become the 51st U.S. state. And in the midst, King Charles offers U.S. membership in the British Commonwealth. What should we understand of this? Some clarity here, more confusion here, Trump in more news.
Well, Trump's attacks on Canada actually helping the liberals, and Trump hasn't helped, the conservatives at all, other than by actually praising Carney, the liberal leader and the current prime minister, who just announced snap elections to take place in end of April. Trump said basically that Carney is easier to deal with, and for all the talk about supporting conservative governments, he is actually rather helping the liberal parties lead far ahead of the conservatives in Canada. Some speculate that Trump's obsession about adding Canada to the U.S. territory has to do with trying to replicate President McKinley's historic Manifest Destiny type effort, which failed at the time. Of course, politically speaking, it's not necessarily advantageous for the Republican Party because Canada overall is a liberal country and would add two most likely Democratic senators to the U.S. Senate and multiple Democratic members of House, which would essentially crush Republican chances for the foreseeable future. But Trump does not seem to be thinking in terms of practical, political, measurable results, and he's just thinking about his territorial legacy. And at this point, it's almost become a fixation of just making a point for the sake of a point, not because it will really add anything, just to show that he's able to achieve that. In terms of the British Commonwealth, I really don't think Trump has thought that through very well. As some joked, that would, instead of making America great again, he would make America Great Britain again. So I also don't really see how that would work from a security standpoint. If US is turning towards the Russia so closely, the entire Commonwealth, Five Eyes intelligence relations would be negatively affected by such a scenario. So I don't really know, but I have a feeling that Trump may not really fully understand what the British Commonwealth is, and he may think it's just some NATO-like defense alliance of English-speaking countries. So it's entirely possible that he doesn't really know what he would be getting into if this were to come to pass.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's see how this whole thing pans out amidst all these things in terms of the ceasefire with Hamas, Houthis. It will all come to an end, and US conducts airstrikes. Uh, how should we look at this one? Again, Middle East going to be a hotspot again, and then we have to again wait for another chance to for another ceasefire. How does it look?
Well, the ceasefire with Hamas is effectively over. Hamas has fired multiple rockets at Israel and also refuses to release the remaining hostages, violating the agreement. Israel has moved in, liquidated multiple Hamas leaders, and essentially made preparations for potential occupation of Gaza and acquisition of some of its territory, at least as a buffer zone, if not for complete territorial annexation. So we are seeing Israel starting to shift its strategy from purely tactical to more long-term strategic reevaluation of its position concerning Gaza. It's also had clashes with Hezbollah. Houthis have fired several weapons at Israel, but failed to make a dent this time around. And Israel is also entered Syria, where it's trying to defend the area from incursions and to destroy weapons arsenals kept there from by the previously by the Assad regime, in the hopes that it will not reach terrorist organizations or Turkish proxies in the future. So Israel has its hands full. At the same time, it's dealing with huge domestic protests over the ultra-Orthodox draft law, over Netanyahu's efforts to fire the chief of Shin Bet, which is the internal security agency, as well as the attorney general. There's an argument that his effort to get rid of Ronan Bar has to do with the investigation of Netanyahu's close associates who have apparently received extensive payments from Qatar during the war after October 7th. Be it as it may, Netanyahu so far is handling the situation deftly in his own favor by restarting the military campaign. He has essentially diverted attention from these domestic troubles and forced the military back out front and away from domestic course of action. So that's there's also potential preparations for strikes on Iran, both by the US and by Israel, but so far Trump is still continuing with very restrained language, focusing on diplomacy. He gave Iran 2 months to resolve the issue of the nuclear weapons and agreed towards to negotiate with the US. Iran so far has been quiet and has not activated in that regard, and US efforts have been focused on Houthis, not on Iran directly. Unfortunately, the story of Houthi airstrikes themselves were overshadowed by the signal scandal, which you probably have heard by now, and which broke out quite unexpectedly a couple of days ago and has been growing bigger even ever since.
Absolutely. And talking of, Netanyahu, Israel, Qatar Gate. Now, it looks like, earlier on when government used to give money to the rebels as well as to the government, it's almost like that. How true does it sound? Means Qatar giving money to Hamas as well as to Israeli officials. Means what should I make of it? This is all manufactured? Is it all about the military industrial complex? Or is it much more less than that? Or much more beyond that? Means as a common person who is looking at peace everywhere in the world and looking at all the diplomacy with much more, on face value, how should we understand Qatar Gate? Does it look real? or is it all again another piece of fake news, misinformation? How should we make, what should we make of it?
Well, the news, the latest development is that Netanyahu apparently was warned twice about Qatari role in all of this and ignored these warnings or went along with them. So far, it's not clear. But what is clear is that Qatar was playing a long-term game. It was helping Hamas set up for October 7th, and at the same time, keeping the Israeli government docile by having close associates of Netanyahu turn a blind eye on what was happening and promoted the strategy that fit Qatar's plans very well, which is to say that Hamas was not planning anything against Israel, that it was focused on governance, and that it was moderated and could be dealt with politically. So the fact that they were promoting this narrative, despite the very fact that they were being bribed to promote this narrative, should have raised their own concerns about why it is that Qatar feels necessary to actually give money to continue the story. But it's very clear that whatever it was affected their judgment and contributed to the counterintelligence failures related to October 7th. So, yes, the whole situation was manufactured. It was manufactured by Qatar, but it was manufactured towards a particular end, which succeeded spectacularly, as we can see.
Absolutely. But what about Netanyahu? He look to be in a stronger position than before, but with all these details, with his fine, all this fight with the Shin Bet chief who's refused to resign, how does it? Is Netanyahu stronger? Is he weaker? Will there be more, more violence in the Middle East because Netanyahu will want to, strengthen his position by taking much more tougher stance? How does it look like for Netanyahu, Middle East as well as peace?
It's certainly very hard to defend the Qatar gate handling, and it's hard to imagine that Netanyahu had no inkling of what was happening. It's also very, many people have raised questions that he has deliberately prolonged the Gaza scenario, at least at some points, for internal domestic political reasons, so as to avoid facing accountability and to score points as a wartime prime minister. At the same time, it's not his staunch supporters are claiming that officials like Ronen Bar and the Attorney General have acted outside the scope of their authority. They have tried to essentially undercut the prime minister with investigations, and they claimed that Ronen Bar was digging into Netanyahu long before the Qatar story broke, and that Netanyahu wanted to fire him long before it was announced that there was a Qatargate investigation. It's not clear who is right about that, but the combination of these factors is not a good look for Netanyahu. The fact that there are many conservatives joining the mass protests we are witnessing, especially over the draft law, but also some of the other issues, raises a lot of questions about how much of this is, at this point, is power overreach for entirely self-serving political reasons, which have nothing to do with immediate security necessity and could be contributing to destabilization, and the sort of distraction that made October 7th possible. But I also don't see his opponents having any sort of plan or vision or a very clear message that would help them overcome this general position. People may be growing tired of Netanyahu and his political games, but they also don't see a compelling alternate vision or execution from anyone else.
Absolutely, Irina. And talking of Qatar, let's talk about the detention of Amit Gupta, Indian national detained in Qatar. How should we understand? What is this story all about?
Well, this whole situation very much reminds me of the previous detentions of Indian nationals, months ago, which took place also in Qatar, and at that time involved naval officers who were accused of spying for Israel. Um,
Right.
so Amit Gupta is a Tech Mahindra executive. He is has been begging to be released. Um, he has been allowed to make contact with his family. But he was basically running regional technical regional issues for the company for Qatar and Kuwait. He's been in detention since January. Nobody has communicated formally what the charges are, and so far it's not clear what's happening. Diplomacy has been enacted, but again, no results. His confinement conditions have been harsh, but most details are known other than he's relatively isolated and only let out 10 minutes a day. There's been efforts to meet with Qatari officials at the embassy as well. And you know, it's very clear that this condition is aimed at exerting huge amount of psychological pressure on Gupta himself. There's a possibility that he could have been mistaken for somebody else. Um, and he hasn't actually been interrogated for the past 2 months. He just been held there. He also has not had any legal access to his counsel, which is very common in Qatar. Qatar is known for mistreating foreign nationals, and there's been multiple cases where high-level executives were accused of spying or some sort of sabotage or some internal industrial malpractice, and held sometimes under very harsh conditions, even tortured in some cases, without any really appropriate legal framework, completely undemocratic, inhumane, and lawless conditions. Unfortunately, working in Qatar has those types of risks. It's entirely possible that Qatar wants something either out of Amit Gupta himself, his company, or the Indian government. But what it is, they may not become clear for a while until there is a higher level engagement by the Indian government or by his company. Amit Gupta himself does not appear to know what the story is all about, and nobody is really communicating with him, that's for sure. Otherwise, he would have certainly let his family know by now. But the fact that he cannot meet with his counsel clearly indicates that this is not a work labor issue. It's some sort of a political matter or intelligence matter that the security services are instigating against him.
Absolutely. So let's wait for more clarity on this matter. But for another student, in the U.S. this time, they're facing deportation on the accusation of ties with Hamas. Court seems to have blocked that at the moment. What's the latest on that?
There's been actually a couple of such cases. In one case, one of the students was accused of supporting Hamas, but it's actually his wife, who is Palestinian, who is more likely to be a direct contact. He may be accused more by association than through direct evidence. That's not clear. He's a graduate student who studied in India originally and who received his degree in India and apparently had some sort of an Islamist educational background at the university, very radical and pro-Hamas. But it's not clear whether he's actually violated any laws and to what extent his support for Hamas violated U.S. laws. Another case is also of a graduate student also with Islamist sympathies, who appears to have been involved in pro-Hamas demonstrations, which creates a more clear grounds for eviction. I think that particular student self-deported before being actually taken into custody by the United States and returned to India. But both of these cases raise questions about some of these students coming into the U.S. Who is should be responsible for waiting them, and don't they present a threat to India's own security upon their return? Should there be any measures to vet the type of education that people are exposed to? Hamas is not designated as a terrorist organization in India, but given the recent meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, which indicated a direction towards a common counter-terrorism, counter-extremism strategy, it would make sense if US at some point asked India to look into this matter, and I think India should probably have an interest in that because this type of organization is very similar and likely linked to Pakistan-backed terrorist organizations that have caused tremendous security damage in India directly.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. And our last topic of the day, let's look at Elon Musk. Means what his special again another envoy who is part of the Doge team. What is happening there after closing this Voice of America? There is a lot of news out there. His Teslas are being attacked, and his company is also worried. But beyond that, I want to understand his strategy about you. On one hand, he is booing our Indian Prime Minister, but on the other hand, he is talking about, taking on Indian government over takedowns on X, and also his role in Turkey also here weakened. So what is Elon Musk up to? Is he wanting to be friends with India? Is he wanting to take on India on some aspects? I want to understand on this as well as his wider role about the Voice of America thing and more that is yet to come.
Well, Musk seems to be having a huge amount of authority that is basically unrestricted, unvetted, and unscrutinized by anyone else. He's not supervised by Trump very closely. So while Trump has clearly given him a very broad direction with respect to cost cutting, getting rid of institutions that don't serve the US interests or the administration's priorities, here I don't think Trump necessarily looks closely into every detail that Elon Musk decides on. I think he basically has just delegated this entire role to him, and Musk almost single-handedly has taken it on without necessarily even fully understanding himself what he is doing. What we know is the result, which is that very few costs have been cut, if any, and the spending has continued to grow because most of the spending is in areas that are not touched by those, which is defense and social programs, entitlements as they call them here, which means that all of these closures have destroyed US mechanisms of soft power without really saving any money for the taxpayers, and also have left hundreds of people, thousands of people out of jobs looking for new positions very suddenly and without any framework for being let go. And it's not clear what will happen with their unemployment benefits and how the US government will ultimately resolve all the labor related complaints. They've had to rehire some workers, some as a result of federal judicial orders, and some as a result of necessity, and some because they were fired by mistake without anyone actually looking who was being fired. All of that looks messy. At the same time, Musk has not been present as the chief executive of Tesla, which has led to assorted financial and legal problems, which included $1.4 billion just disappearing into nowhere, safety issues causing Tesla to be thrown out of the Vancouver car show, and assorted suspicious rebates associated with the company, causing Canada to suspend Tesla from its rebate program. All of these things do not look good for Musk. Whether or not he was directly involved, it still looks like he's not managing it properly. That caused a lot of ire with his shareholders. He finally returned, apparently made it look like he was taking aggressive action to remedy these issues, calmed everybody down at a board meeting, and then went back to doing what he does best, which is essentially talking a lot about his assorted activities. As far as the Indian, so at the same time, there's been essentially a political arrest of the very popular mayor of Istanbul in Turkey, a rising political star with close ties to the Kurdish population, who was projected to be a potential contender against Erdogan in the 2028 races. Clearly, he was arrested under false pretenses along with several other opposition members. Mass protests broke out. Per Turkish request, or perhaps even without it, Musk has taken down at least 85 accounts covering the protests and supporting the people demonstrating against these highly charged arrests. In the meantime, when India apparently requested that he removed some accounts for whatever reason, he sued the Indian government, claiming political interference with his company. So, to be honest, I think this is an entirely political decision on his part. For whatever reason, clearly there is some positive dynamic going on with the Turkey. Head of intelligence is expected inside in the US in the near future. With respect to India, Musk has met resistance with having Tesla enter the market, and I think this is his way of trying to put pressure on India. Either you allow me to do business freely, or I am going to make you look bad as an undemocratic government, and so forth. And we have seen simultaneously that the US Religious Committee has also criticized India while this was going on, and over its treatment, I guess, of religious minorities. Now, normally, there's been problems with that committee in the past. Now they're supposed to be comprised of Trump appointees. Why they would have a problem with India is unclear, but it is also possible that they are actually following a broader and coordinated strategy with the rest of the administration. It may be that Trump is unhappy over the way the tariff negotiations is going. It could be that it's entirely Elon Musk driven situation. It could be that these people are simply misinformed. But whatever the case may be, these are the two major negative developments happening very closely together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.